Ever feel like someone's always trying to, like, control your every move?
I know what you mean.
Like, down to the smallest things. Like, even your choice of breakfast cereal is part of some big master plan.
Yeah.
Well, Milton Friedman, he gets that. In Free to Choose, he's not just like some economist droning on about numbers, you know? He's talking about freedom, real freedom.
Yeah, the freedom to build your own life.
Exactly. Your own career, your own everything.
Friedman argues that economic freedom, the freedom to choose your job, your investments, what you're buying and selling, it's the foundation.
Yeah, it's like the bedrock. So, like, forget all this abstract big picture stuff for a sec. Are you saying my freedom to, like, rock a funky hat is tied to my freedom of speech?
Precisely. Friedman would say that when a government starts controlling the economy, it inevitably ends up controlling other parts of people's lives too.
It's a slippery slope kind of thing.
Exactly. Think about it. What if you couldn't choose your own job? The government just assigned you one. How much freedom would you really feel like you had then?
Not a lot. It'd be like being stuck in a school uniform, but for life.
And you might have everyone looking the same on the outside,
Right, in their uniforms.
but underneath, everyone's itching for something different. He contrasts this with, the vibrancy and the innovation that you see in a free market. When people can pursue their own passions, their own economic interests,
Start businesses, choose what they want to buy, what they want to sell.
it creates this dynamic system that benefits everyone, he'd argue.
Okay, I get that. But hold on. Didn't places like the Soviet Union, didn't they try that whole centrally planned economy thing? How did that work out for them?
Not well, to put it mildly. Friedman points to those examples, to illustrate what happens when you suppress economic freedom. These systems, they often led to shortages, economic stagnation, a real lack of innovation.
Because there's no incentive to do better, right?
Exactly. Without that individual choice, that competition, the whole system just becomes stagnant.
So no funky hat innovation coming out of those places. But if I'm reading Friedman right, he's not saying the government should, like, completely disappear.
Yeah, right. You're right. That's a really important nuance to understand. He's not advocating for anarchy here. Friedman believes in a limited government, one that focuses on protecting individual rights.
Enforcing contracts, making sure there's a level playing field for everyone.
Exactly. He's wary of government overreach. Situations where a policy might sound good on paper, they have good intentions, but they actually do more harm than good.
Can you give me an example of that? Like a time when the government tried to fix something and it just totally backfired.
Friedman talks about post-World War II America. To try to combat inflation, the government at the time imposed price controls on a bunch of goods and services.
Okay.
So, like, trying to cap the price of bread or rent or whatever sounds good in theory, right?
Yeah, keep things affordable for people.
Mm-hmm.
Seems reasonable.
Right. Who wouldn't want that? But those price controls ended up really messing with the natural ebb and flow of supply and demand.
How so?
Well, if businesses can't adjust their prices based on what's actually happening in the market, it throws the whole system out of whack.
So instead of things getting more affordable, you end up with...
Shortages, black markets, a whole mess of unintended consequences.
It's almost like trying to control a wild animal, you know? You might think you're helping by caging it, but you're really just disrupting its natural rhythm.
That's a great analogy. Friedman would say that markets, they're not perfect, but they often self-correct better than we think.
Interesting.
And that sometimes the best thing the government can do is just step back and let the market do its thing.
Okay, so if we're talking about the government, like maybe taking a step back in certain areas, what's Friedman's stance on education? Isn't that usually seen as something the government should be heavily involved in?
It is, traditionally. But Friedman, he's got some radical ideas about education. Well, he'd argue that the traditional public school system, the way it's often set up, it can function like a monopoly with very little incentive to actually improve.
Because they're the only option, right?
Exactly. So his solution, school vouchers.
Okay, school vouchers. Break that down for me. What does that even mean?
Imagine this. Instead of the government giving money directly to schools, they give it to parents in the form of vouchers.
Okay.
These vouchers represent the funding for their child's education.
Got it.
Parents then use those vouchers to choose any school they want for their child, public, private, whatever, as long as the school meets certain standards.
So it's like giving parents the power to shop for the best education.
You got it.
And wouldn't that like force schools to up their game to attract students?
Exactly. It all comes back to competition and choice. Friedman believes that by introducing market forces into the education system, you incentivize schools to improve, to innovate. They have to compete to attract those students and their vouchers.
It's like saying to schools, hey, you're not just competing for funding anymore, you're competing for students' minds.
Exactly.
That's a whole other level. But wouldn't that, create other problems?
Well, it's definitely a controversial idea. Critics argue that it could end up disadvantaging low-income families, for example, or even lead to further segregation in schools.
Right.
But Friedman's main point is to get people thinking differently about how we can achieve the best possible outcomes in education.
To challenge the status quo.
Exactly. He wants to empower parents and really shake things up.
See, that's what I love about Free to Choose. He's not just throwing theories around, he's making you really question your assumptions about how the world works. He's constantly saying, hey, what if we tried this? What if we looked at it this way?
He's all about challenging those assumptions.
And sometimes those what-if questions, those crazy ideas, they lead to real change. And speaking of shaking things up, Friedman was never one to shy away from a controversial topic, especially when it came to inflation. So inflation, back in the day, people just blamed businesses for, jacking up prices.
It seemed like the easy answer.
But Friedman, he had a whole different take on things, didn't he?
He did. It drove him crazy when people just pointed the finger at greedy corporations.
They were an easy target, I guess.
Totally. But Friedman, he argued that inflation wasn't really about individual businesses.
It was something bigger.
Way bigger. He said it all came down to the money supply.
The money supply. And this is where his whole monetarism thing comes in. I gotta be honest, though. Monetarism sounds a little intimidating. Is this something I need an economics degree to understand?
Not at all. It's actually pretty straightforward.
Okay, good. So, what's the connection between money and inflation? How's that work?
Okay, imagine this for a second. You and your friends are all trying to get your hands on this limited edition pair of sneakers, right?
Okay, yeah. Limited edition sneakers. Everyone wants them.
Everyone wants them. And let's say you've all saved up $100, because that's the going rate.
Makes sense.
But then, suddenly, everyone mysteriously gets an extra $1,000.
Okay, suddenly everyone's got money to burn.
Exactly. So what happens to the price of those sneakers?
Bidding war. They're going way up, that's for sure. Way more than $100.
Exactly. Now, imagine that same scenario, but instead of sneakers, it's the entire economy.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
If the government, through the central bank, prints a ton of extra money, it doesn't magically create more goods and services to buy, right?
Right, it's still the same stuff.
It just means there's more money floating around to buy the same amount of things.
So each dollar is worth less.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is inflation.
Wow, okay. That actually makes a lot of sense. So, next time I see one of those headlines about inflation going up, should I be thinking about the central bank?
Friedman would say absolutely. He'd say, don't just look at the surface level,
Don't just blame the corporation.
Exactly. Don't just blame corporations. Don't blame global events. Dig a little deeper. Look at the role of government policies. Look at the role of those central banks.
It's like they're controlling the printing press for the entire economy, aren't they? Which brings us to another area where Friedman had some strong opinions, welfare. And those opinions weren't always super popular, were they?
That's an understatement. He was very skeptical of traditional welfare programs.
You mean those programs where the government directly gives assistance to, like low-income families?
Exactly.
Was it that he didn't think we should help people in need?
No, not at all. He just thought there was a better way to do it. He worried that these programs, while well-intentioned, could actually trap people in a cycle of dependency, that they could discourage work and personal initiative.
So, people become reliant on the system and lose the motivation to improve their situation.
That was his fear. He believed in helping those in need, absolutely.
But he wanted to do it in a way that didn't have those negative side effects.
Exactly. He wanted to find a system that helped people while still encouraging them to work, to be self-sufficient.
So how do you do that? He wasn't advocating for just, letting people fend for themselves, was he?
No, not at all. He had a radical idea for a different approach. He called it the negative income tax.
The negative income tax. Okay, now that just sounds like something straight out of a science fiction novel.
It does sound kind of strange at first, but it's actually a pretty simple idea.
Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine a system where everyone who's earning below a certain income level gets a direct payment from the government.
A direct payment?
Direct deposit right into their bank account.
Okay.
No complicated paperwork, no stigma of being on welfare, just direct financial support.
So instead of having a million different programs with a million different rules,
Yeah.
it's just one streamlined system.
Precisely. And here's the negative part. As you start earning more income, that assistance from the government, it gradually phases out.
So there's like a built-in incentive to earn more.
Exactly. You're always better off earning more money, even if it means you get a little less assistance from the government.
So it's about providing a safety net, but not a hammock, as they say.
Perfectly put. And that's the beauty of this idea. It sparks all these important questions.
Like what?
Like, how do we balance individual responsibility with social support? How do we help those in need without creating unintended consequences?
It seems like these are questions we're still wrestling with today, right?
Absolutely, especially with all the talk about universal basic income and things like
Oh,
that.
yeah, yeah. Like, are those the same thing? Are they totally different? So much to think about.
Yeah.
And it all ties back to that classic tension that we see throughout free to choose freedom versus equality.
Right.
Because Friedman would argue that you can't always have maximum freedom and perfect equality at the same time.
He was a big believer in challenging those assumptions, those ideas that we often take for granted.
It's like that old saying, right? Can you really have your cake and eat it too?
Right, right.
Can we have a society with maximum individual freedom, perfect equality at the same time? Friedman, he wasn't so sure about that, was he?
No, not really. He liked to push people's thinking on that one.
He did, didn't he? He'd argue that going for total equality, like redistributing all the wealth, it could actually backfire.
It might sound kind of counterintuitive, but he believed that kind of approach could actually stifle innovation and make everyone worse off in the long run.
Because if everyone knows they're going to end up with the same size slice of cake, no matter how much effort they put in, wouldn't that make some people less motivated to, bake a bigger, better cake in the first place?
That was a big part of his argument, yeah. He was worried that focusing too much on equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity could actually discourage hard work, discourage people from taking risks.
So it's like, yeah, let's make sure everyone has a fair shot at baking that cake. But let's not tell them how big it has to be or what kind of frosting they have to use.
Precisely. Level the playing field, but don't try to guarantee identical results.
Because that can stifle creativity, right?
Of course, this doesn't mean we just abandon social safety nets altogether
Right, right.
or ignore the people who need help. Remember, Friedman was all about helping those less fortunate, but he thought we should be smart about it.
Find a way that helps people without, like, crushing the human spirit.
Precisely. We need to find that balance. How do we ensure fairness and opportunity for everyone while still encouraging the very things that drive progress and innovation?
Big questions. And I think those are questions that each generation kind of has to grapple with for themselves.
Absolutely. The answers might change over time, depending on the circumstances. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating, right? Friedman, he might not always give us easy answers, but he makes us think. And he definitely wasn't afraid to, like, poke the bear a little bit, to challenge the conventional wisdom of his time.
He was a master at that.
And, whether you agree with him or not, you can't deny the impact he had. Free to choose. It wasn't just some book that sat on a shelf in an ivory tower somewhere. It had real-world influence. We're talking about leaders like Ronald Reagan, their policies, their whole approach to government. It was heavily influenced by Friedman's ideas. Tax cuts, deregulation, putting more emphasis on free markets. That was all straight out of the Friedman playbook.
He shifted the entire conversation.
And what's even more amazing? His work, it's still relevant today. All these years later, we're still debating these same issues. Healthcare, education, the role of central banks, you name it, we're still grappling with the implications of Friedman's ideas.
It's a testament to the power of his ideas.
It really is. And I think it's because free to choose, it goes beyond just specific policies. It digs into those big fundamental questions about what's the role of government, what does individual freedom really mean, and how do we create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive?
He's asking the questions that really matter.
And those are conversations that we need to keep having. So as we wrap up this deep dive into free to choose, we want to leave you with this. What's your answer to Friedman's question? How do you balance individual liberty with a need for a just and equitable society? It's a tough one. There are no easy answers, but that's what makes the discussion so important. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into ideas that matter.